This thing is my copy of John Milton's Areopagitica. In the 1990s, when I was in my early 20s, I lived next door to an old theatre actress whom I knew as Madame Talbot. She had a very posh accent and a house full of old books, and I really liked her. And I visited her whenever I could. I loved the smell of her house. It was all dust and roses and that smell of old book. We drink really weak tea together and talk about the weather and the neighbours, but not really much else, at least not from her side. She was old-fashioned and reluctant to talk about her personal life, but she was, happy as anything to hear me talk about my boyfriend problems and how much I hated my boss and the usual travails of a 20-something and give me advice. Now, I knew she'd come to Brisbane from Melbourne in the 50s after what she called, I'm quoting, the death of my beautiful boy, Eric. She often referred to my beautiful boy, and I lost my beautiful boy. And I assumed that this meant that she'd lost a child. And I was just too awkward, I guess, to ask about such things, to ask for details. So I never really learned the full story. And the other thing was I didn't really know what was going on with her husband, whether she even had one, whether she might have had a child out of wedlock, and maybe even her calling herself Madame might have been a way to cover up the fact that she wasn't married. So it was all too hard to ask, so I didn't ask, and we never spoke about it. Anyway, just after her 70th birthday, she became obsessed, or started to become obsessed, with the idea that she was going to die soon. And so she went around the house putting the names of her nieces and nephews on the backs of her possessions so they'd know who would get what when she died. And it was around this time too that she started giving away her books by the dozens. It seemed every time I went around there'd be fewer books on the shelves. And one day she gave me a whole carton of them, lots of fantastic books about myth and history, the things that I liked. And this book, Milton's Areopagitica, was among them. It was really special to me because it came from her, and also because it was so old, and it's still the oldest book I've ever owned. But I wasn't particularly interested in Milton's thoughts on licensing and censorship, so I never actually opened it. I put it in a box, and it went away with my other things when I went overseas to travel and study. So fast forward about 10 years, Madame Talbot had died while I was overseas, and of course I'd missed the funeral and I'd missed the whole thing basically. But in that way that the young have, I'd let her slip out of my mind anyway, which I very much regret now. But now I was home again, and I was writing about Milton. And I remembered the book and I dug it out. And when I opened it, on the flyleaf, it has written, "For my wife, with love from Eric, 1948. Eric had been her husband, not her child. And so it made me wonder, why had she called him a boy, her beautiful boy? Because she had an unusual surname, it didn't take me long to Google up Eric Talbot's family in Melbourne. Ancestry.com is, of course, great for these kinds of things. And I shot off an email to them, and his great niece Laura wrote back to me about 3 weeks later. And it turns out that Eric, Madame Talbot's husband, had died of measles in 1949 when he was just 20 years old, 1 year after they'd married. And the reason that she called him my beautiful boy was because in her mind, he never reached adulthood. And she did, and she went on and she became an old lady. But to her, he was always a beautiful, beautiful young boy. Anyway, I offered to send the book back to Eric's family, but they insisted I keep it. And I often glance at it and I think about Madame Talbot and her house full of dusty treasures. And I often wonder if she ever realised that she'd given me this treasure by accident. And that is the story of this thing.